So what I want to deal with now is another part of Rabbi Baeck's legacy, a controversial part. And an individual came over and commented to me before, you should know that Baeck himself was not an uncontroversial figure. Richard Rubinstein, a very uncontroversial figure. Richard Rubinstein, who's famous or infamous as the most prominent Jewish death of God theologian. In his book, The Cunning of History, he writes about Baeck. I'll just say a couple of stories. It was interesting that after World War II, Baeck spent the last 11 years of his life mostly in London and Cincinnati. He taught at the Hebrew Union College during that period. I want to say this nicely. American educational standards were not exactly the same as the German gymnasium. And for people like Baeck, they not only knew a great deal of rabbinic sources and the Bible, but the entire classical tradition of Greek and Roman writings and thoughts were just sort of known by heart by most youth in Germany. So I understand that when he lectured at HUC, he had a very, very heavy German accent. Students had a very difficult time understanding him, and that was only reinforced by the fact that he would always quote these Greek, Roman, as well as rabbinic writings, most of which, quite frankly, American students were just not familiar with. So he wasn't necessarily the most outstanding pedagogue during his years in Cincinnati. But having said that, my teacher, Eugene Borowitz, said that when Baeck was there, he would live in the dormitory with the students. And Dr. Borowitz once said to me that he was walking down the hall, Borowitz, and he noticed Baeck was at the other end, and he notices Baeck is just standing there by the door. And he realized at a certain moment Baeck was waiting for him in order to open the door for him. I mean, it was just a matter of his, as it were, politeness and the way he was in the world, so that Borowitz then walked at a bit brisker pace. And it says something, I guess, again, about his personality. But one of the things that he did, and I don't even know, again, what to make of this. I just think of Kantian notions of duty. There's a great debate that was held between Martin Buber and Hermann Cohen, the great German Jewish thinker. And in one of the lines I liked the best, Hermann Cohen, who was a great, great Kantian, and life is really about performing your duties, he was also a notorious anti-Zionist. And he once wrote to Buber, he said, you know what the problem with you Zionists is, Buber? He said, you think life is about being happy. Namely, you just want to be normal. And Cohen wrote, life isn't about happiness. Life is about pflichten. Life is about duties. And I thought that kind of summarized, I sometimes cite this in lectures because it summarizes some of the difference between Zionist and anti-Zionist in an earlier period. But Rubinstein points out that when Baeck, on the day before he was incarcerated in Terezin, his last act was to go to the power company in Berlin, and he paid his electric bill to the company. This is the last act he performed before he was imprisoned in Terezin. And I'll only say that Richard Rubinstein, the Jewish death of God theologian, pokes fun at this and says, you know, what a comical character he was, that he carried the notion of duty to this. Once more, I'm not certain how to completely respond to that. I don't know that if I knew that I was about to be sent to a concentration camp, that my last act would be to be certain that all my bills were paid. But it says something about Germans who were raised with this 19th century notion of, I'll call it Bildung. I don't know, how do you translate Bildung? Cultural rectitude, I don't know, in a broad... Yeah, being a Yeka. The other thing is that the decisions he had to make. So I want to make a couple of comments. Before I became president of Hebrew Union College, I always knew the right decisions to make. It actually turned out that when I had no responsibility, I was able to always make the correct decision. They were actually fairly easy to make. Once I became president and had to worry also about a budget, decisions became much, much more difficult. One of the things I had to learn, because before I became president, I had never been an administrator. I had only been a professor, and people would come to me and they would tell me ideas, and I would go, oh, that's a good idea. And then persons would say to me, they'd come back, other people in my administration say, so-and-so said you've committed to doing X. And I went, well, I didn't say we would do X. And they said, oh, but you said it was a good idea. And I went, well, it is a good idea. So I learned after going to a meeting early on in my presidency that the line had to be when a colleague would come up and give me a good idea, I would always start by saying, that is a great idea. How do you propose we pay for it? And that usually ended the conversation on many an occasion. But we're going to also talk about areas of truth-telling. And what is it you do when you're a leader? We talk about we live in an age of transparency. Leaders probably should be transparent, but I can tell you this. If you're completely transparent all the time, you'll probably never get anything done because there's so much opposition that will usually be marshaled as you're planning things. But in any event, I want to talk then about the issue of truth-telling. We have the holiday approaching upon us, and we're going to see that one of the areas of controversy for which Baeck was, I think, more seriously chastised, condemned, etc., had to do with two cases that we're going to deal with now. And I wanted to begin by, you'll see here it's entitled, if you have the sheets, Truth-Telling and Jewish Tradition, the case of Rabbi Leo Baeck and the Holocaust. And again, I'm going to tell you that for me personally, I do not have an absolutist sense of what the right thing to do or not to do was in the cases that confronted Baeck. And here I also add, many of you undoubtedly know the blessing that's recited in traditional congregations by the father of a bar mitzvah, Baruch Shepatarani, me ansho shel zeh. Thank you, God, for sparing me from the punishment that this boy deserves, because prior to the bar mitzvah, the father is responsible for all the sins of the child, so that you say, Baruch Shepatarani, thank you for releasing me. Let my child take care of his own sins. I have to say, in the last year or two, given the events at the Hebrew Union College, I often say every day, I begin not with Modeh Ani, that I thank God for restoring my soul, but I begin the day, Baruch Shepatarani, thank you, God. I'm not the president anymore. And when people call me about events that are occurring at the college, I just say, talk to the president. And for some of you here, one of my best friends is Arnie Eisen, who was chancellor of JTS, and we just talked last week, and Arnie and I don't know how to put it, other than to say we're very happy campers. The best title in the world is immediate past president or immediate past chancellor. You don't have to deal with all of this. So the question in part is, what about truth-telling? So I thought I'd begin with a philosophical position that was taken by Immanuel Kant. Kant is undoubtedly the most prominent moral philosopher of the modern world. And again, there are thousands of essays and books written on Kant, but I thought that what I would take here is a famous position that's described that Kant took in regard to truth. Namely, Immanuel Kant held, you have to always tell the truth. In Jewish tradition, the seal of God is truth. In traditional davening and traditional prayers, at the end of the 3 paragraphs of the Shema, you begin, when you start to daven, when you start to pray again, with the words, Hashem Elokeichem Emet. The Lord your God is true, is truth, Emet. So I don't want to indicate that Emet, is not an important Jewish value. But there are times in the tradition we could go through it. Certainly for the sake of peace, you're permitted to not always necessarily tell a truth that will unnecessarily hurt someone or not. Kant seems to take a different position. And here I take something that that was written in 1797, and it's a dialogue with Benjamin Constant, who was a Swiss political philosopher and activist. Constant wrote, or stated, the moral principle it is a duty to tell the truth would, if taken unconditionally and singly, make any society impossible. Here I think of Mark Twain and some of his writings, where Mark Twain will say, don't you know the difference between a truth that helps and a truth that hurts? We have proof of this in the very direct consequences drawn from this principle by a German philosopher, Kant, who goes so far as to maintain that it would be a crime to lie to a murderer who asked us whether a friend of ours, whom he is pursuing, has taken refuge in our house. So I just got through watching a series called A Small Light. Have any of you seen this? It's about the Dutch woman. It's a story of Anne Frank, but told from the perspective of a Dutch Christian who harbored the Frank family for over 2 years before they finally were uncovered by the Nazis. According to this line in Kant that we're about to look at, when Nazis came to their business to say, are you in effect harboring anyone here? Kant would say, you have to tell the truth, namely, yes. So Constant, speaking of Kant, says it's a duty to tell the truth. The concept of duty, Pflichten, if we get back to them again, is inseparable from the concept of right. A duty is on the part of one being which corresponds to the rights of another. Where there are no rights, there are no duties. To tell the truth is therefore a duty, but only to one who has a right to the truth. But no one has a right to a truth that harms others. That's Constant's opinion. Now, Kant, if you have by a lie prevented someone just now bent on murder from committing the deed, then you are legally accountable for all the consequences that might arise from it. But if you have kept strictly to the truth, then justice can hold nothing against you, whatever the unforeseen consequences might be. It is still possible that after you've honestly answered yes to the murderer's question as to whether his enemy is at home, note the theoretical that Kant has provided here. If you say to someone yes to the murderer's question as to whether his enemy is home, the latter may have gone out unnoticed so that he would not meet the murderer and the deed would not be done. But if you lied and said that the person is not at home and the person has actually gone out, though you're not aware of it, so that the murderer encounters him while going away and perpetrates this deed upon him, then you can by right be prosecuted as the author of his death. Everyone get the theoretical that he establishes here? Someone comes to you and says, I want to kill X, and you've seen him go in that room. Is he in that room? If you don't answer truthfully, and you say no, then the person might run out this way, but what is it that they're going to discover? This guy left that room and went out into the foyer, and then he caught him. I mean, this is the theoretical, and then you would be legally culpable for this person's death. You have to love philosophy in every way. For if you had told the truth to the best of your knowledge, then neighbors might have come and apprehended the murderer while he was searching the house for his enemy, and the deed would have been prevented. Thus, one who tells a lie, however well disposed he may be, must be responsible for its consequences even before a civil court, and must pay the penalty for them, however unforeseen they may have been. For truthfulness is a duty that must be regarded as the basis of all duties to be grounded on contract, the laws of which is made uncertain and useless, if even the least exception to it is admitted. To be honest in all declarations is therefore a sacred command of reason, prescribing unconditionally one not to be restricted by any conveniences. Any reactions to Kant? What do you all think? Okay, yes?
I have trouble. I never enjoyed studying philosophy. I don't know why. People come up with these big structures and make generalizations about things, but life isn't like that. I mean, when you're dealing with real situations and real people that you're dealing with are different. There are different points in their lives. They have different tolerances for information, and there's all kinds of differentiation that I think is required in my opinion.
Would you say in general you should tell the truth? Yeah?
I attended a college with an honor code, and if you lied on some official question, you would be expelled. There was no other, nothing. It could be a minor issue. But there was also the concept of improper questions. You couldn't ask somebody if they had done something wrong. They weren't, that wasn't proper. And this was an improper question.
Okay. Anybody else? Any thoughts? Yes?
Yeah, when I was in 10th grade, I attended a high school in suburban Paris with my brother, and he had attended a Quaker school which had an honor code. And he caught someone cheating off of him, and he went and told the teacher. And in this suburb where the school was, most of the teachers were either socialists or communists, and a lot of them were Jews. And instead of being congratulated, she made my brother stay in during lunch and write 100 times on the blackboard, "I will not rap."
Okay, yes?
My understanding in Jewish tradition of so-called white lies to save someone feeling being hurt. It's appropriate.
Yeah, I mean, there's a book by Cecilia Baeck. Some of you may know her, a moral philosopher who taught at Harvard, called Lying. And she basically affirms there should be some discretion that people exercise when they do or don't tell the truth. But leaving that aside for a moment, clearly, since we mentioned Hannah Arendt before, as Hannah Arendt put it when talking about politicians, said politicians have never really been on intimate terms with the truth. So I'll just observe that. So in any event, you have Kant. For Kant, there are no exceptions. What about Jewish tradition? So clearly, within Jewish tradition, what I should say is the value of peace generally takes precedence over necessarily always telling the truth. But I wanted to point out this other issue, because what we're going to be dealing with Baeck is, was he under an obligation? And this is something for which he was severely criticized. Was he under an obligation to reveal the totality of what the situation was confronting the Jews in Germany in the 1940s. And that has been the major area of critique of Baeck. But here I just wanted to point out, this is an essay by Moshe Feinstein, I assume not related to our Rabbi Feinstein who's here. Moshe Feinstein was the head of the Rosh Yeshiva of Tiferes Yisrael in New York. He was the leading posek, the leading Orthodox rabbinic judge, decisor in the United States, and in many perspectives in the whole world during his lifetime. His work, Igrot Moshe, is cited by rabbinic authorities throughout the world. So I just took one response, and I could have cited 100 other sources in Jewish tradition, but because of time, I just wanted to take one that will illustrate, in Rabbi Feinstein's view, you're not in every instance, from a Jewish perspective, required to adhere to a Kantian standard of absolute truth-telling. In fact, he even urges you not to in certain cases. So here the question concerns the issue of triage. It's from volume 2 of his halachic work that he wrote Moshe, and I hope my translation is a good one. If any of you want, you can go check it later. Who should be treated and who should not be treated? So this is the case. Rabbi Feinstein writes, the case you pose concerns 2 patients who were brought into the hospital. And here I do want to emphasize, I did not bring this up because necessarily the medical ethical question, that would be a whole other topic. I brought it up here because it deals with the question of, do you have to be completely candid? Do you have to tell a patient the complete truth about his or her condition in every instance? So 2 patients are brought into the hospital. Both are in need of immediate emergency or critical care. One of them has a good possibility of being cured, but it is not absolutely certain that he needs intensive care. Although it seems that that would be the preferred method of treatment. So an individual comes to the hospital in an emergency room. He has a good chance of being cured. You're not certain if he needs immediate ICU care, but he might. That would be the preferred mode of treatment. If there was no issue of triage, meaning there was no other patient or you had the resources, you would always have put him in the ICU. However, the second patient is about to die, for whom intensive care can only provide a postponement of death, can't live at all without the ICU. Which patient should be given the only bed available? So everyone understand, you have 2 patients who come to the hospital at the same time. It's an issue of triage. Who's going to get the intensive care bed when, in the case of the second patient, the only thing you're able to do is to delay that person's death? That person is going to die. Feinstein writes, in my opinion, if both arrive at the same time, the decision should be made on the basis of medical suitability. If they both arrive at exactly the same moment, the one who has the best chance of being treated and cured should be given the available bed. However, if the one who can only live for a short time has already begun treatment before the arrival of the second, for whom there is an expectation of a cure, but can only be saved if the first patient, whose life can only be prolonged for a short time, is removed from life support, it is forbidden to interrupt the treatment of the first patient in order to save the second patient. Does everyone understand this? In other words, if all things are equal, you should treat the patient who has the possibility of their life being saved. But if you've already started on the second patient, then you can't remove him. That's what Feinstein rules. The individual who can live only a short time is not obligated to forfeit, it should really state, even a moment of his life for anyone else. Once he's taken possession of the hospital facility, and his life, however short it will be, depends upon continued treatment, his claim takes precedence over all other claims. The patient himself is not required to give up his place to the patient who can be cured, and maybe not even permitted to do so voluntarily. However, in an instance where they have not yet placed the terminally ill patient in the ICU, they should first place the patient who may be cured in the ICU, even if he arrives later. So patient A, does everyone understand this? Patient A, who cannot be cured, gets there first, but you haven't put him in the ICU. Then patient B, who can be cured, does show up later. You can skip him, as it were, in the line, and he takes priority over patient A because there's a possibility that he will be cured. But this is only in the case when the terminally ill patient does not know that the physician's opinion is that it's not possible to cure him. What if the patient comes in and thinks that his life could, or her life could still be saved? In that case, if giving precedent to the other patient means that the terminally ill patient understands that it is not possible to cure him, and this will agitate him and thereby possibly hasten his death, as it will cause him to become terrified, then it is absolutely forbidden. In other words, the point being, Feinstein says, you don't really have to tell the whole truth. You know, the doctors in their judgment are asserting this person can't live any longer, but the person doesn't know that. If the person comes to the realization they're skipping over me because they think I don't have a chance to live, and they're putting the other person in front of me, and that will agitate the terminally ill patient, then you can't reveal to the terminally ill patient the full truth. You can't allow the terminally ill patient then not to be treated. So the terminally ill patient, here's the exception, gets precedent over the non-terminally ill patient, really out of the terminally ill patient's ignorance. Does everyone understand this? Am I being clear about this? I mean, there are a lot of terminally ill, not terminally ill. Basically, what it really amounts to is you're not required to tell the full truth. And again, I mean, we have a lot of rabbis here, and I presume doctors. Question is, do you tell persons the full truth about their condition, or do you hide some of it from them? Jewish tradition states it's better that the patient doesn't know his condition, and the caregivers have to be careful not to tell him. It is also forbidden to reveal his true condition to him. I brought this here not because of medical ethics. That would be a different seminar. I brought this here because the point being that here's an example of where Jewish tradition in the Jewish responsa literature of Jewish case law, actually asserts you shouldn't necessarily tell someone all the truth. You should really hold things back from people depending on the conditions. In this sense, Jewish ethics are contextual. I don't know that I want to call them relativistic. Some people might. But they are at the very least contextual. And one of the interesting things about responsa literature, and here I would say there's a difference between codes of law and legal judgments. Codes of law are general. They establish rules Legal cases involve the question of how are the rules applied in a real-life kind of context, and therefore contextual ethics are much different. One of the areas I do a lot of study in is response to Jewish case law on conversion. Maimonides rules that it's clear in the Mishnah Torah, his code of Jewish law, that an individual cannot marry a woman who is his captive who converts to Judaism. In other words, there's been a war, women are captured, the woman comes to live in this man's house, the man and woman basically fall in love with one another, she converts to Judaism. Maimonides says you can't perform a wedding. That's the rule, because that would seem to indicate that the man would be exploiting this woman who, for whatever reason, finds her attractive, etc. But when actual cases are decided by Maimonides with these exact circumstances, he permits the marriage. He rules against the law as he himself codified it. I can't interview Maimonides to ask him why he did that, but I imagine he has, this is my romantic way of viewing it. He looks at these two people, they come before him, he thinks, oh, well, they love each other, she's converting, let me just do the wedding. That's a nice way of interpreting it. I don't know if that's really the case, but I bring it up here because rules and cases are not always decided in the same kind of way, and there is a contextualization, and Jewish law is casuistic. It always deals with context. The rules are easy to apply until you have real people. Or another example of contextualization. Jewish law is explicit. There's a rule in the Shulchan Aruch, Yored Deah 268:12. Any of you can look at it. You are not permitted to convert for an ulterior motive. The law is just clear. If you want to convert someone and that person desires to marry a Jew, it's forbidden to do the conversion. You cannot convert for any ulterior motive. Now, my bet would be if we have anyone here who are Jews by choice, converts, or you know people, I'm going to bet that only about 90% of the people you know have converted because they've met a Jew. That isn't always the case, but usually. So the question is, how does Jewish law permit that? Well, there are two cases in the Talmud. One, some of you may remember Rabbi Hillel. There's an individual who comes first to Rabbi Shammai and says, I want to convert because I want to become the high priest. I like the high priest outfit, and I want to convert and become the high priest, which of course would not be possible, but leave that aside. Shammai throws him out. The person then comes before Hillel and says, Et gayer al manat she'eh Kohen Gadol, I will convert if you make me the high priest. And Hillel converts him. So you have a case, it would be called, I think in legal parlance, accepted custom and usage. Hillel is one of the most powerful rabbis in the Talmud. The fact that Hillel, a Tana, an early rabbinic authority, allows this means that it is possible, despite the law, to convert people for ulterior motives. Or in what is the best case in the Talmud, there's a woman who's the most beautiful woman in the world. It's in Menachot 44a and b. Most beautiful woman in the world. And a student of a rabbi named Chia comes to this woman, and she's a courtesan, I'm trying to use polite terms, and she gives him a certain amount, he gives her a certain amount of money in order to sleep with her. At the moment that he is about to have illicit sexual relations with her, his tzitzis fly up and hit him in the face. And you'll all remember from the third paragraph of the Shema, Ure'itemoto, when you look at the tzitzis, it will remind you of all of God's mitzvot. And the student of Rabbi Chia says, see, this is what we should teach in Talmud. The students would find it probably interesting. The woman says, why is it you won't sleep with me? Do you find me unattractive? And he says, no, you're the most attractive woman in the world, but I can't violate Jewish law. The woman then goes the next day to his teacher, Rabbi Chia, said, I really didn't know much about your tradition, but this is what happened with your student. And if this tradition is that powerful, then I want to convert to Judaism so I can marry your student. And that's, of course, what occurs in the Talmudic story. I guess we'd call it, since we were talking about Jung and psychiatry for the shrinks here, rabbinic fantasy, I guess, in a certain way. So the rabbis in the Talmud asked the question, how is it, the medieval commentators, the Tosafot, how is it that Hillel and Chia could do these conversions? And there becomes a principle, hakol lefi re'ut einei habet din. Everything depends upon the subjective judgment of the rabbinic court or the rabbi. So the point I'm making again is the Jewish tradition, there are rules and there are principles. And I can tell you in reading halachic materials, if a rabbi cites the phrase, hakol lefi re'ut einei habet din, everything depends on the judgment of the rabbinic court, they always permit the conversion. It's a subjective principle. In general, in legal systems, principles trump rules in general. I could go into this another time. The point I want to make here is Jewish tradition is contextual. In general, you should tell the truth. But if the truth is going to cause harm to someone, you're not required to be fully candid, according to Rabbi Feinstein. By the way, this part that's all in black here, these responses of Rabbi Feinstein's were translated by his son-in-law, who was a professor of both biology and a rabbi at Yeshiva University. These lines are actually not translated by him. And I think the reason is, and we don't have to have a long discussion, I would just ask if those of you who are doctors, I think, and I might be wrong, that best practices today would mean that a doctor would be completely candid with a patient. Is that true? But this was like 40 years ago that he wrote this, and it was interesting. I think that his son-in-law was embarrassed to translate this into English. That's just my own theory. So the key point I want to make is that in Kantian thought, you're supposed to completely tell the truth. And in order to look at Baeck in a moment, I want you to see the Jewish tradition countenances not revealing all of the truth depending on the conditions. Now I just want to take, before we go to Baeck, one last point. Because here is a problem with the examples I'm taking. Question of whether you're required to always tell the truth or not. We're going to be dealing with cases during the Holocaust. The Holocaust is just not a normal type of context in which most of us make our decisions. So that even though it's true that Jewish tradition holds that you don't always have to be fully candid, that there are values like peace, concern for the psychological state of individuals that can trump telling a full truth and that allow for discretion, I do want to indicate at least that in talking about the Holocaust, I am aware that the Holocaust may just be a unique kind of situation. In other words, can you use these normal ethical k'nei midah, these normal ethical measurements to judge what Rabbi Baeck did during the Holocaust? So here I just want to point out that the UCLA and Tel Aviv University historian Saul Friedlander I would argue, the greatest scholar in the world on the history of modern European anti-Semitism. I'll look to Professor Rosen. I mean, that's fair to say, isn't it? I mean, he's pretty good. In his introduction to Probing the Limits of Representation, he quotes David Carroll, who refers to the Holocaust as the limit case of knowledge and feeling. This is a concept that signifies an event or related circumstance or practice that is of such magnitude and profound violence that it ruptures otherwise normative foundations of legitimacy and civilizing tendencies that underlie political and moral community. In other words, in his book, Professor Friedlander wants to say that, just as the book's title indicates, there's just a limit to representation in talking about the Holocaust, that it is such a profound rupture in all the values and understandings and boundaries of how people should live, that it may just be unique. You may be able to draw analogs from it, but Friedlander wants to indicate perhaps you can't. So I do want to indicate, when we talk about Baeck, at the very least, we're talking about someone who made decisions within this context. And an example of such a limit, case, or event situation, I just use this one, is Sophie's Choice by William Stern. I'm sure most of you know it, but my synopsis of the book, movie. Here the major protagonist, a Polish Catholic woman named Sophie, confronts such a case that seemingly lies beyond the realm of moral imagination. In the story, Sophie, the mother of a boy and girl, is forced by a Nazi officer when she enters Auschwitz to choose life or death for one of the children. How many of you have read the book or seen the movie? Yeah, so just about all of you know it. In other words, this woman enters into a camp, and a very sadistic guard says, I'm going to kill one of your children unless you select which one gets to live. That is exactly what Friedlander means by a limit situation. She pleads, and I always see Meryl Streep in this, don't make me choose, I can't choose. Think of anyone here who has children or grandchildren. What if you were told, well, both your children were going to die, or both your grandchildren, unless you selected one of them? I mean, it's really unthinkable. How could one make this kind of choice? And she screams, don't make me choose, I can't choose. At that point, a young Nazi officer is ordered to take both children away, and Sophie bursts out, take the little girl, and her little boy is consigned to death. Sophie herself, as you'll remember, is unable to bear her decision. She falls into despair, goes insane, and is unable to live with her choice. She commits suicide by ingesting cyanide. In other words, she responds probably the only way a person could logically respond to having made a choice. But what kind of choice was it, really? It's no real choice. But one child lived and another didn't. But this is what I mean by, when we talk about the Holocaust, we're talking about situations that don't really have a clear kind of parallel. So I do want to at least indicate that, and it could be that when we talk in a few moments, the question is, can you draw, what is it that Baeck's decisions in this case would say to us who live in non-Holocaust kinds of context and circumstances? So now I'm taking two cases from Michael Meyer's book, Rabbi Leo Baeck, Living a Religious Imperative. By the way, if you're interested in really reading more about Baeck, there's a popular book by a man named Baecker, B-A-K-E-R, called Days of Sorrow and Pain, Days of Sorrow and Pain, Rabbi Leo Baeck and the End of Berlin Jewry. So Baecker, and that book won a Pulitzer Prize, and it was written about 1978. And then there's a book by Albert Friedlander that was based on his doctoral dissertation at Columbia in the religion department. It's called Leo Baeck, Teacher of Theresienstadt. And that book really analyzes the totality of Beck's religious thought. Meyer's book is the only one to entitle it Rabbi Leo Baeck, Living a Religious Imperative. Meyer purposely looks at him as a religious figure. And I have both books mentioned here, so it's good I put them in. So here are the two cases. In 1941, Baeck learned for the first time of the fate that confronted Jews who were transported to the East, slave labor or death. Many of you may remember in Elie Wiesel's book, as impossible as it is for us to believe today, the book actually begins night with Mocha the beetle coming and saying, they're slaughtering people. This is Hungary in 1944 in death camps. And people don't believe him. Im lo yasupar lo uman. If this wasn't told, it would be impossible to believe that as late as 1944, in areas in Central Europe, people did not know that there were death camps as opposed to concentration camps. No one thought they were pleasant, but they didn't know that these were really factories for murdering people, burning them to death. Yet he chose not to inform the German Jewish community of the fate that awaited them. So does everyone understand? Baeck knew this at this juncture in 1941. In fact, Baeck, during this period when Jewish persons would be taken into captivity by the Nazis, Baeck didn't even tell his students. He got students at the Hochschule. This would be the equivalent of my knowing this and telling students at Hebrew Union College, you need to aid these elderly people as they get ready to be deported. And my students think that they're just helping elderly people. Baeck did not want Gestapo guards to be the ones going into the house and helping these people remove their belongings. He had his students do it, but he did not tell his students what the anticipated fate of these people were. This becomes a very controversial point later on. I got the first indication of Nazi bestiality in the summer of '41. A Gentile woman told me that she had voluntarily gone along with her Jewish husband when he was deported. She saw hundreds of Jews crowded into buses, which were driven off and came back empty. The rumor that the buses had a gassing mechanism was confirmed by the apparatus attached to all but one of them. The one carried a group to bury those who were gassed. Afterwards, the gravediggers were shot. Remember, the concentration camps in the beginning, however horrendous they were, and they were really horrendous, they escalated to becoming literally death camps where people were burned to death in Auschwitz, Birkenau, and other places, only later during the war. This, again, isn't the point or time to give a whole lecture on the Holocaust, but what you have in the Holocaust is a constant escalation, first of legislation against Jews, and then physical violence. Kristallnacht seems like a picnic compared to what occurred later in Auschwitz. It doesn't make it a picnic, it just means that there were escalations, and there are many scholars who think part of the reasons for Hitler's success was that he understood how this policy of gradual escalation would allow him to fulfill the final solution. Similar stories were told by soldiers who came back on furlough. Thus, I learned then in 1941 that lots of Jews shipped east, that the lot of Jews shipped east was either slave labor or death. Baeck elected not to inform his community. The reasons for this were several. He believed that armed resistance was futile. Secondly, Baeck feared that he would multiply suicide among Berlin Jews if this were known. Hundreds, if not thousands, of German Jews committed suicide during this period. Finally, he felt there was always the possibility that some Jews might somehow survive. Baeck probably felt it was better that Jews live with an illusion that survival was likely or possible, rather than confronting his people with the reality that death was almost certainly their fate. So Baeck refused to tell the full truth, in the same way that Rabbi Feinstein, in radically different conditions, doesn't want to tell the patient who's unknowing of his medical or her medical condition that you are terminal. So Rabbi Baeck makes the choice not to tell his students and not to tell the Jews of Berlin what the fate is that is in store for them. And then you have the case of Theresian. In 1943, while incarcerated in Theresienstadt, where 4 of his sisters died, as we talked about earlier, his brothers were killed elsewhere, Baeck learned of the almost certain death that confronted those who were taken by cattle cars eastward from Theresian. While he no longer occupied a formal position in the community, Baeck faced the same dilemma he had in Berlin. Should he inform the Jews of Theresian of the horrific destiny that almost certainly awaited him? As the so-called work transports departed Theresian in October 44, Baeck stated after his liberation, when the war came to an end, the following words: "I did not know whether the transports were going for certain to Auschwitz, but that intention was probably to murder immediately whoever was not fit for hard labor, and to let those who were capable of working for the war machine eventually perish from hunger and deprivation. That I knew as the Gestapo's goal. At the time, I was caught up in the pangs of conscience. Should one shorten the agonies of those destined for departing transports through a self-initiated massacre, or shorten the agonies of those destined for departing transports through a self-initiated massacre, or given some, even if only very, very few, a chance for survival? I finally said to myself, even if only a single person will survive, we may not sacrifice that person." After the war, some survivors said Baeck made the right decision. One survivor, Charlotte Opferman, put it, "We did not want to know, so many suicides already." Or as another, Ruth Brody, stated, "We knew the transports meant severance from family, exile to the unknown, starting all over again, more arduous conditions. Had we known what they really meant, we would not have been able to endure." So you have 2 people who survived the Holocaust who basically, in interviews with Michael Meyer, said, "I am alive today because Rabbi Baeck did not tell me the truth of what likely lay before me." But then he had a very good friend, Paul Tillich. Tillich and Baeck were friends. Baeck himself was an anti-Nazi who was expelled by the Nazis. He came to America, taught at Union Theological Seminary. His position was not that of Carl Jung. He resisted the Nazis. Baeck, the great Protestant theologian, disagreed with Baeck's decision. While a close friend and admirer of Baeck, Tillich felt that the full existential truth should always be made known to all, just as an incurable patient should always be told the full truth. That's Paul Tillich, the Protestant theologian. What do you say? What do you think?
What about the element of the responsibility of each individual to ask the question? Not responsibility, but criminal patient, where, how am I going to tell me the truth, God, if I want to know?
Well, if someone were to say, really tell me the truth, here the case is a little different because you have an entire group of people.
But one person in the group said.
Well, but if one person in the group is told the truth, you're telling the entire group. In the hospital, you have one patient. I mean, here it's a bit, it just adds another layer to the decision-making process. I mean, if someone were sick and were to say to the doctor, I want to really know the truth, I think most doctors would tell them that. Yeah, Yoav?
So I want to give maybe a Kantian response. I don't mean to defend Kant entirely, but I think there are maybe good reasons why we might think that we should tell the truth.
Here, just wait and get the...
I mean, as you said, these are impossible decisions, and it's who knows, but I think there are at least some reasons why we might think that truth-telling, even in difficult circumstances, might be the right way forward. So these are three answers that a Kantian might give.
Yeah, just stand up and maybe speak louder for everybody.
Okay. So
You've got people my age here,
sorry,
that's all I'm saying.
I'll give three responses that a kind of Kantian might give. I mean, the murder example is an extreme one, and so Kant's philosophy would maybe take us to extreme positions, but I think there are reasons why we might think truth-telling is often the right thing. So the first is that, you might think that if we're figuring out what our responsibilities are, we should think about what we ought to do in an ideal situation, even if we will fall short of that. And so you don't want to institutionalize the exception. The exception should be an exception, not the rule. And so you could think that we should always strive to tell the truth, but we might, in certain circumstances, not, without wanting to legitimize or permit the deception, because that could lead to the second problem, which is if the maxim is a subjective one, then every person can decide for him or herself what situation permits deception or lying, and then the question is who decides. And so there's a subjective piece of this which Kant wanted to get away from.
Right.
And the third relates to I think the point that the gentleman was just making, which is that you're taking away people's agency. So in Kantian language, you're not treating them as rational agents endowed with choice. You're taking away their ability to make decisions about how they want to live or confront their potential death. So I think those are three potential reasons that,
I think you've made three excellent points for why he should have told them. But keep in mind, there would have been people who would have committed suicide as a result of that, and they wouldn't have been available for Michael Meyer to interview. What? Wait, just one at a time. Wait, maybe just get the thing and just speak slower and so we can all hear. Where's the microphone? Okay, but can you let her speak first and then we'll go over? No, it's fine. I just want one at a time. It'll be easier.
I believe that maybe Leo Baeck believed in his reasons. I think they were also it made life easier for him not to say anything, but I disagree. I think some people would commit suicide, and that was a better fate than going to the East. And some people, even in the 40s, some people somehow managed to get out of Europe. So his making this decision, now I'm not saying I'm judging him because it's not a time where I can't put myself in his shoes. But I think after everything, he should have said, maybe I was wrong. And we should say, maybe he shouldn't be so highly esteemed.
Well, I think that's the point about agency that Yoav made. It does take away the agency. The question of whether he should be highly esteemed, I think, is another different question. The gentleman over here, and then you're next, okay?
I can understand the reason why Leo Baeck did not disclose everything he knew to the community in that there's always, for some people, as you said, some hope of survival, and to put it in terms of Viktor Frankl's philosophy, that there's the search for meaning and possibility. And my question for you, if you know the answer, is, did Frankl and Baeck know each other or know of each other at all?
I suspect Frankl certainly knew of Baeck. Baeck had a prominent public role. He was the official head of the Jewish community in Germany. I don't think there were many Jews who didn't know who Baeck was. After the war, I would suspect, but I don't know, that Baeck learned of Frankl, but I don't know if he knew him before. Okay.
Thank you. Wonderful lecture. I took your reference with regard to Maimonides' Code of Jewish Law, that no conversion or no marriage of the captured woman by the Jewish soldier is to be performed, but I didn't understand how there could be subsequent rulings by Maimonides that would allow that, because there's no analogous situation in medieval times to this biblical issue.
Well, what does happen, in other words, Maimonides doesn't rule that the woman can't be converted. She can be converted. She just can't marry the individual in whose home she lives.
But she's not a captured woman.
But there were cases in Egypt that actually came before him where women were maidservants in homes of Jewish men. The women did convert, and he did allow the marriages. The Holocaust actually states there can't be any ulterior motive, and the rationale, this would be a course on Jewish marriage law, is that it would imply that the behavior of the master was immoral in relationship to this woman, and that's why he's not allowed to marry her. But in reality, when cases came before him, he did permit it. And I've often thought, Solomon Schechter, the head of JTS, wrote a whole article in the 19th century, my favorite century, about a dozen cases in Maimonides where he rules against the law as he codifies it in the Mishnah Torah. The only point I wanted to make is that codes usually deal in generalities and rules, and cases tend to be very specific, so that people sometimes rule in different ways. What you want in law is predictability, and because you want it to be by analogy, and you get predictability except when you don't. That's what I would say in studying these cases. In other words, there are rules, but then you take a look at how people rule in actual cases, and they're not always so consistent. And if you're interested in the issues of conversion, there's an incredible book, even more interesting than Hungarian responses, Orthodox responses to apostasy, called Pledges of Jewish Allegiance. Danny Gordis and I wrote a book published by Stanford Press on Orthodox rabbinic rulings on conversion. And they're interesting to read when you look at case law, not codes. Okay, we had a few more hands here. Yeah, oh, here, this woman hasn't asked a question yet.
Okay, I just think that about telling the truth or not telling the truth to the community, I think that it was mentioned about giving the people agency, but I think it's arrogant to make a decision for everybody of what is right for them, what they would want or whatever, and you take away their opportunity to make decisions of what they want to do at the end of their life. They might want to be talking to their children, talking, getting things out that they haven't had a chance to, or it might be very important to them. It might make their life more meaningful.
It could. I mean, you have to keep in mind, I don't think any of these people thought they were going to a picnic, to put it rather mildly. And no, I think your point is a good one. The problem is, I guess, when you engage in leadership, you're making decisions often that will impact many, many people in ways that individuals may or may not always have full knowledge of what it is that they're confronting. I think it's hard when you're in a position of leadership, but I do understand your point, and I think it's a variant of the agency issue that's been brought up several times.
Yeah. I think you started in the afternoon the lecture, אל תדון את חברך עד שלא תגיע למקומו. Don't judge a person until you get to this place. And you mentioned also that the Holocaust is a unique case. So I find that it's very difficult for us to judge Leo Baeck one way or another, or to guess what we would have done in this place. To his credential, I must say that the fact is that he stayed. He had many chances to leave, and he stayed and went with his people to the concentration camp. So although he knew what is at stake, but he still stayed to stay with his people, and that tells me that maybe under these circumstances he did the right thing.
Well, that may be why people still hold him in high esteem. Whether they should or not is another issue. Okay.
I see this truth to the Holocaust being unique, but to me, that is not an important distinction here. I see it as whether you're talking about one individual or you're talking about more than one. It could even just be 2, or it could be 2 million, or anything in between. The thing is, it relates back to the end of the hypothetical about the what the doctor should do in the hospital, the triage.
Right.
You might have somebody who is fine being told, yes, you're at the end and I'm sorry, but that's how it is. But you might have somebody who would get so panicked that would in itself contribute to their
Well,
death.
that was the point Rabbi Feinstein
Right,
made.
exactly. By suicide, or you could have the whole community panic. I mean, there could be like rioting and people could get, trampled to death, or I mean, who knows what would happen, right? I mean, it's terrible. So when you're dealing with this group and you have this range of possible reactions, what Baeck did was to play to, you might say, the weakest of the possibilities. And that's what they said was the right thing to do in that earlier hypothetical, right?
Okay. Other people? Here and then here. We'll have this young woman.
That being said, that you cannot be in someone else's shoes in such a horrible situation, but people did find ways to hide. They called themselves submarines. They were in hiding, sometimes in plain sight, sometimes with the help of neighbors. Not everybody, but if they knew what was the alternative, I think more people might have survived. And that's the thing, how many more? We'll never know.
I don't know that you can calculate that, but yes, it's another hypothetical. Yes, this gentleman here in the yellow shirt.
Thanks for raising these issues, and I certainly agree with the many people who stated that it's impossible for us to put ourselves in the shoes of people who had to make those decisions at that time. But I read several books this year that really opened my eyes to this very question. And one it's a book called The Escape Artist by an English author named Jonathan Friedland, who wrote about the life of Rudolf Verba. And Rudolf Verba was one of two people who successfully escaped from Auschwitz. And the importance of his story is that he realized that the people coming did not know what awaited them.
Right.
And he felt it was his mission to escape and to tell people, especially in Slovakia, and he was from Slovakia and from Hungary, to let them know. He realized that if they knew, they would resist. And what he meant by that is they wouldn't go willingly. And they would put up a fight. Many would be killed, but it would not be the mass slaughter that Auschwitz turned into.
Well, I think that's the point made here, where we see Leo Baeck made a judgment that resistance was futile, but who knows, that judgment might have been wrong. That doesn't mean to me, I'll say, that I would necessarily judge him harshly, because I don't know what I would do, but it's not an unreasonable position. Here, Mr. Epstein, and then we'll go to Rabbi Feinstein.
Isn't the idea of selective truth-telling corrosive to the whole society? Because then when can you really trust the leader? I'm a trial lawyer, and when other lawyers would somewhere in the middle of their thing say, sincerely, I'm telling you, the judge, this. The minute he used the word sincerely, what about everything else that he had said? But there is the story about Felix Frankfurter, when Jan Karski, then a young Polish diplomat, had evidence that Auschwitz was going on at a death camp. He went to Felix Frankfurter with the ambassador from Poland, told him that, and Felix Frankfurter said, I don't believe you. The ambassador from Poland said, are you saying that Mr. Karski is lying? He's a very honorable man. No, I'm not saying he's lying. I'm only saying I don't believe you. That was selective avoidance. It would have been better if he'd just said, I believe you, but we're not going to do anything about it. And I think the whole idea of selective truth-telling is corrosive to society.
Okay, Nora, maybe just remove your mask for 1 second.
Just a question. Did Rabbi Baeck ever reflect in his writings on this time in his life and his own decision-making process after the fact?
I don't think, I'd have to ask Michael Meyer, who knows everything that he wrote, and there are 6 volumes of his writings that have now come out in German. He certainly had interviews, and Meyer quotes from them, but I don't know that there's a lot more that would be significant that Michael doesn't quote in his book. One point Meyer does make in the book is that Baeck, he does think psychologically, kind of believed in martyrdom as a religious figure, and he points that out. He thinks it's an aspect of Baeck's religious stance that led to elements of Baeck's decisions, perhaps, in these cases. What is interesting, regardless of critiques that have been issued, in an overarching way, there is no question that German Jews really looked to Baeck. One of the interesting points is that Baeck, at the time when the German Jewish community had to have a leader, it is interesting that they did not select a business person, an attorney, a politician, that they turned to a rabbi. And here I would say that Friedlander's book also deals with the complexity of this. I think in general, you're quite correct. Selective truth-telling is corrosive. Question is selective truth-telling always corrosive, and is there ever a time where a white lie, I use that term, or discretion, to quote Cecilia Baeck from Harvard comes out unquestionably feeling there always has to be discretion on the part of the truth teller. On the other hand, it has to be rare, and there have to be certain circumstances. That's at least her argument. And there is no question Jewish tradition, beyond the one responsum I gave you, absolutely allows for discretion, particularly if shalom, if peace is at stake. I mean, there are hundreds of sources that reflect on this. Peace is generally considered a greater value. I mean, there is the very famous midrash, it's probably been quoted from this pulpit 1,000 times, that when God came to create the world, the angels protested and they said, you know, human beings are going to be deceitful, you can't really trust them, you shouldn't create them. And God just throws truth to the earth and creates the world, creates the universe. There are numerous cases where the rabbis discuss even God lies. I mean, I could give you 100 examples in the Bible. For example, and I'll finish in 1 second, 2 minutes. I have 1 second. So one story where God lies. Samuel is about to anoint David as king. Samuel knows that if Saul knows that he's going to anoint David as king, that Saul will kill him. So God says, look in the book of Samuel, just tell Saul you're going to offer a sacrifice of an animal, and for that reason, he won't kill you, and then you can anoint David. So the rabbis point out that even God lies as a kind of warrant for allowing untruths to be stated in certain occasions because of the gendered issues here. Many of you remember, and you'll read the story over the high holidays, where Sarah laughs when she's told that she's about to give birth at, how old is she again, 90? 90, and Abraham's 100, but the rabbis point out the reason she really laughed wasn't because she didn't think she could conceive, but because Abraham, she didn't think would still be fertile at that age. And therefore, in order not to tell Abraham that your virility may be problematic, she was a good wife in a traditional sense, she doesn't really tell Abraham the truth. I hope that what we've been able to do today is to look at an exceptional figure in a position of extremists, there's no question about it, and that what this at least will allow you to do as we prepare for the high holidays, I hope, one, that it is a fitting tribute to Rabbi Haberman and that he would have enjoyed it had he been here today. He certainly knew Rabbi Baeck well, and that as you all think about the holidays, and I look to the rabbis here in particular, maybe you've got some sermonic material now, I don't know. So I'm happy to do that. As someone said, quoting the prophet Micah to me earlier, Ma Hashem Elokecha doresh mimcha, what is it that God requires of you? Asot mishpat, do justice, ahavat chesed, love mercy. And you should walk humbly with God. I hope at least, I don't know what it always means to do justice, and I don't even know what it means to love mercy, and how do you judge which one should be primary, but here I would say that the idea of at least walking humbly and understanding how difficult the positions people can be in is probably helpful as you move into the new year. L'shana tova tikatevu v'tokotenu. Thank you all very much.